Renegade. In the status quo of Valencia in 2018, the diplomat explains that China and the U.S. have struck a delicate but peaceful sense of normalcy in the South China Sea, agreeing to enhance relations to prevent military escalation. Because of this, Blumenthal in 2012 reports that the U.S. must continue current policy. The only world in which conflict occurs is a world in which China's geopolitical and economic interests in the South China Sea are threatened by the United States. Accession disrupts this balance and compromises Chinese interests in the region in three ways. First, by cornering China. Again, right in 2016, that UNCLOS has a tribunal court that mediates territorial disputes. The U.S. would rely on tribunals to legitimize and enforce claims against China. Problematically, the New York Times in 2016 reports that Western imperialism looms large over the South China Sea and that tribunals are seen as maintaining a liberal order that exclusively protects Western interests. However, if China loses, they are pushed into a corner and forced to retaliate, leading Mitchell in 2007 to conclude that UNCLOS dispute mechanisms double the probability of militarization. Second, by projecting American exceptionalism. De Tolve in 2012 writes that accession to UNCLOS would strengthen U.S. power projection operations in the South China Sea. Problematically, Chinese ambassador to the UK, Liu Jiaming, explains in 2018 that U.S. meddling in the South China Sea is disrupting peace talks between ASEAN members, warning that further meddling could destroy the relative tranquility assembled through ASEAN conferences. De Tolve furthers that failure to ratify UNCLOS allows China to influence countries to come to a bargaining table, allowing for a peaceful resolution of the South China Sea. Third, by emboldening allies. Orchard writes in 2018 that countries in the South China Sea dispute are running out of steam, with Haydari furthering in 2018 that countries like the Philippines are hard-pressed to find the benefits of standing up to China and are moving toward a policy of accommodation and compromise. However, Beneco finds in 2011 that accession would restore faith in a rules-based international order, causing countries like the Philippines to throw away compromise politics in pursuit of a larger piece of the pie, returning the South China Sea to turmoil. Additionally, Kreska writes in 2015 that U.S. allied countries have overlapping maritime claims, meaning that even if allies come out on top, the focus of tension would just cause countries to pull daggers on each other. There are two likely scenarios that would occur as a result of these tensions. The first is a Sino-U.S. war. Farley explains in 2018 that Xi Jinping has boxed himself into a corner on securing the South China Sea, citing various internal political commitments. Blumenthal furthers in 2012 that China has great strategic, economic, and political interest in controlling the region. This leads Farley to conclude that Xi would declare war if China's stability in these areas are threatened. Scoville in 2018 explains that further straining the U.S. relationship with China would threaten the conventional conflict. Problematically, Lauther furthers in 2011 that China would be unable to maintain a conventional military campaign due to America's superior military technology and would resort to the nuclear option. This is why Robertson explains in 2017 that a war with China would be one of the bloodiest wars in history, concluding that the death toll could reach the millions. The second impact is cyber terrorism. Pepperin in 2015 articulates that Chinese patriot hacker groups have a track record of hacking countries after being pressed in the South China Sea. Pepperin furthers that as tensions escalate in the South China Sea, the attack would target critical infrastructure. This is problematic because, as the U.S. House of Representatives reports, American infrastructure and critical systems are incredibly vulnerable to cyber attack. A report by the Mission Support Center agrees, finding in 2016 that 50% of the U.S. electrical grid is vulnerable, specifying that terror organizations pose an increasing threat to the integrity of U.S. electrical systems. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission furthers in 2014 that attacks on 9 out of 55,000 energy substations in the United States could result in a blackout that lasts indefinitely. A successful cyber attack is able to shut down the grid. Would be catastrophic. The Cybersecurity Market Report finds in 2016 that grid collapse would leave millions of Americans without running water, refrigeration, light, and a dwindling supply of food and medical supplies, effectively crippling the United States. Frank Gaffney of the Center for Security Policy in 2014 provides a long-term impact, finding that an indefinite blackout could kill off as much as 90% of the U.S. population.
Judge Reardon?
Okay. Just the size of the screen so I can see the timer over there.
Okay. All right, want to start?
Yeah.
All right, I'll start time now. We affirm our sole contention is tensions in the South China Sea. The South China Sea has become increasingly tense as China makes growing claims over ocean territory. Chaudhary of the Economic Times writes in 2018 that China's disregard of maritime norms and militarization on their artificial islands has turned the South China Sea into a dangerous flashpoint. Aggressive responses by the U.S. have worsened the situation. According to Dennis Adler in 2018, the U.S. has persistently overplayed its hand with aggressive policies, forcing China to respond with increasing vigor. This back and forth has pushed the two countries ever closer to conflict. Farley of the National Interest writes in 2018 that a conflict could transpire from firing in contested waters, confrontations in airspace, or submarine encounters, especially as activity increases from both countries. Haas of The Guardian portrays the imminence of the situation as he writes, "There is no doubt the US and China will fight a war over the South China Sea within the next decade. However, acceding to UNCLOS will prevent war in two ways. First is reducing tensions. Yang of the Straits Times explains in 2018 that China's aggression is out of self-defense. Massive US weaponry in the region has pressured China to militarize. However, Jennings of Forbes writes in 2018 that if the US were less aggressive, Beijing would have less of a reason to expand. Conversely, when the US ramps up aggression, China responds by militarizing. Affirming the resolution solves this because UNCLOS forces the US to take a peaceful approach. Article 279 of UNCLOS states that parties shall settle any dispute concerning this convention by peaceful means. Thus, with UNCLOS, China will have no fear of a US escalation, removing the need to militarize. Second is improving dialogue. Because the US is not a member of UNCLOS, China often uses this to distract from substantive discussion. Nevitt of UPenn writes that as the US routinely emphasizes UNCLOS provisions, China is quick to remind the US of its non-party status, often leading to a diplomatic stalemate. Indeed, Hook of Washington University furthers that the US's non-party status is useful diversion from substantive issues that are more difficult for China to answer. This prevents strong dialogue. However, effective dialogue is critical to averting conflict. As Rieker of the Institute of International Affairs writes, dialogue can reduce misunderstandings and lower tensions, making it a prerequisite for political solutions. For this reason, the UN Development Program finds that violent conflict has recently declined as international dialogue has increased. The impact of a war is threefold. First, tensions decrease trade. Morrow of the Political Science Review writes that political disruptions create a risk for business, meaning only the most profitable businesses can afford to continue trade and establish new enterprises. Indeed, in a 23-year study, Gawarkowicz empirically finds that political tensions with China have negatively correlated with trade levels. This bodes poorly for the Chinese lower class, as trade has been critical to reducing poverty. According to Lee of Asian Social Science, China's trade liberalization has led to rapid reductions in rural poverty. Reducing trade will remove the resources and markets that have been instrumental in this movement. The second impact is sanctions. Farley of the National Interest writes that in the build-up to war, Beijing and Washington will both press for sanctions and freeze each other's assets. Problematically, sanctions are often felt most by the vulnerable populations within countries. Cashin of World Finance writes in 2017 that as history has shown, sanctions can have unintended catastrophic consequences, often creating widespread suffering among the populace of a targeted state. The third and final impact is war. With advanced military capabilities, war between the two countries will lead to countless deaths. Star of the Root writes in 2017 that due to China's greater devotion of military resources to the region, US forces would be significantly challenged. Thus, both the US and China would suffer tremendous casualties. Abs of Reuters explains that in an instant, the loss of a single aircraft carrier could easily cost thousands of lives. War would also have devastating economic impacts. Wynn of PRI writes in 2017 that war causes losses in bilateral trade, reductions in consumption, and harm to regional trade. He quantifies that the US could lose $2 trillion in GDP and China could lose $4. Unfortunately, this will increase poverty as the Department for Development writes, economic growth is the most powerful instrument for reducing poverty, which is why Stevens of Hofstra finds in 2008 that a 1% increase in GDP growth reduces poverty growth by 1.8%. Thus, we are proud to affirm. Ready for prompt?
Yeah. First question.
Sure.
Okay, why is U.S. accession to UNCLOS key?
Should I reread my case?
I want you to reread your internal link.
All right. So basically what we say is two things. First is Article 279, which says that parties can't use force in any sort of dispute, meaning that the U.S. has no credible threat of action in the South China Sea. And then secondly, improving dialogue. What Nevitt says is that we've been stuck on squabbling over UNCLOS for the past decades, which means that we can't get to actually any effective discussion.
This is where my question is. Okay, squabbling is still dialogue. How do you prove that your dialogue is constructive?
Well, they can get past the point of whether or not the U.S. has acceded to UNCLOS. I mean, effectively, UNCLOS doesn't really affect the dispute in itself. What they need to understand is what their goals are and what kind of concessions they can make so that they can solve.
My question is why. One second. Can I have a follow up?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. So why does that manifest explicitly because of UNCLOS? Why does UNCLOS explicitly facilitate constructive discussion?
Well, I mean, you can read our evidence. It's pretty explicit in stating that UNCLOS is creating the diplomatic stalemate that has prevented them from getting to actual substantive discussion. It literally says that UNCLOS is used by China as a distraction. Can I ask a question?
I'm still confused, so can I ask one more question?
Yeah, go ahead. Let's clear this up.
If UNCLOS is creating a stalemate, right, how does U.S. accession stop that stalemate?
Oh, we're talking about diplomat. Oh, right. So basically what happens is that they can stop arguing about whether or not the U.S. is a member of UNCLOS and whether or not they care, but actually get to the meat of the discussion and actually their interests. Can I ask a question? All right, so let's talk about your first warrant. You talked about this tribunal. But why would the U.S. choose to go to the tribunal to resolve disputes if China just disregarded the ruling in 2016?
America would choose to go to the tribunal in an attempt to reassure our allies and kick China out of the South China Sea.
But no, why would they go there if China's just going to ignore what happens?
Because they want to craft an international consensus as to whether or not Chinese actions in the South China Sea are legal.
Okay, sure. You can ask a question.
Okay. So, can you explain the internal link to your trade liberalization argument?
Yeah, so basically what happens is that when there's more trade, you have more markets overseas. More markets means that people are going to buy more stuff.
What's the internal link between, why is it that when we accede to UNCLOS, suddenly, all this trade liberalization starts happening?
Right, so basically this is our motto of TSR. He says that when you have political disruptions, things could happen. For example, shipping routes could get blocked, or a country like, for example, China, there's a lot of economic retaliation. So at any time when there are high tensions, that means that businesses can't afford to continue trade, which means that they have to cut jobs. Now I'd like to ask you about your second and third links. You talk about peace talks with ASEAN, but what about the dispute about innocent passage with US? Is that being resolved now?
Not really, because
okay, cool. You can.
The argument is that both sides are in a legal screaming match, and that there's not going to be any resolution.
All right, sure. You can.
And that's probably because of UNCLOS vagueness, but sure, I'll ask another question.
Okay.
Oh, maybe not.
Could I see your Ricker evidence, or whatever it's called? Political solutions.
Oh yeah, sure.
That was 15 seconds, and then could I see the second impact on sanctions?
Sure.
You only have one part on that, is that right?
Well, we have the one link and then the impact.
Yeah, I just want to see the impact.
All right, guys. You can ask for evidence in that. That's not an extended form of cross-examination.
Yeah, sure.
Then just ask for the evidence.
So are you asking for the one for widespread suffering? Yeah, cool.
That was 20 seconds total.
Just going to start at the top there. Is everyone good?
Yeah.
All right. Their first contention talks about the South China Sea, they talk about the ocean territory, and they talk about how the South China Sea is a flashpoint. The problem with this analysis is that our narrative literally answers back their case. The only world in which China would engage in a conflict with the United States is a world in which its interests in the South China Sea are threatened. This is because the South China Sea is an economic hotspot, and it also carries geopolitical and strategic interests for China. This becomes super important because the cession uniquely threatens Chinese control over the region, and we would argue that Chinese control over the region is a good thing. Under the affirmative world, FONOPs and other military excursions in the South China Sea get uniquely worse because the United States has the legal backing to do things, and the differing interpretations is the root cause of war. But then, let's go on to his scholarly evidence. He talks about miscalculation. Recognize an affirmative world would increase the risk of miscalculation because there would be more military excursions, whereas in the status quo, there has been no miscalculations. If their arguments are true, then we would have seen conflict occur in the status quo. Their first warrant talks about decreasing tensions. They tell you that China is militarizing out of self-defense. This argument doesn't make any sense. As time progresses, countries gradually militarize. That's literally how the trajectory of the world is. But even more so, recognize that they talk about how China would use peaceful means. China would not use peaceful means if their interests in the South China Sea are threatened, because China needs the South China Sea to exist as a legitimate country in the East Asia region. But even more so, recognize that there is no reason to defend themselves if there is no threat in the status quo. At this point, our narrative answers this back again, because we tell you that there is no threat in the status quo, that's why there is no war in the status quo. The only risk of a war occurring is a world in which China feels the need to lash out, and China would only feel the need to lash out if the US is pressuring them via our warrants in case. Their second warrant talks about an increase in dialogue. They cite Nevitt, and they talk about non-party status. The problem with this analysis is that there's no hypocrisy. The United States literally follows all customary international law, and we follow most of UNCLOS. There is no perceived increase in international legitimacy as a result of literal accession. But you can turn the argument for two reasons. The first is because countries, specifically China, don't want to engage in diplomatic talks with the US at the table. Countries like China prefer bilateral agreements. What we're seeing is in the case of the Philippines or even Vietnam, China sidesteps UNCLOS and uses bilateral agreements. This is fundamentally a good thing because China prefers a divide and conquer strategy. The second way you turn it is fundamentally, if there are more voices at the table, there is less means for compromise. More people all have confounding interests in different ways, and there is a decreased likelihood that countries would compromise if they need to advocate for more things. But then let's go into their first impact. They talk about decrease in trade. This is super important because it literally gives us access to our impact. We tell you that trade is super important. Trade would be decreased in the affirmative world because the United States would commit freedom of navigation operations and also increase its grip in the South China Sea. The only thing holding back the United States from entering the South China Sea and pushing China out of the region is the fact that we haven't acceded to UNCLOS. This is incredibly good because if China is pushed out, they lose their trade routes. Trade is super important because if China loses its trade route, that's what would trigger a war. We tell you that China needs control over the South China Sea, and that is uniquely good because the alternative is China going to war over these smaller countries. If Vietnam, the Philippines, or Taiwan, say, were to speak out against China, China would make an example of them and engage in a war. The comparative weighing is clear. Making these countries be bullied by China is better than them engaging in a war with China. But then let's go into their second point. They talk about sanctions. The problem with these is that sanctions would exist right now if their arguments are true. But even on the war impact, recognize that both must link into war. The problem is you have to weigh the strength of link. We outweigh our strength of link for two reasons. First, because of our starting point. Our uniqueness claims are very good. We tell you from the Valencia and the Blumenthal evidence that the status quo is really important and there's no risk of conflict in the status quo. The second way is because the directionality of link, or the only way war could occur, is if you affirm and disrupt the peaceful balance that's right now.
You need.
Yeah.
Alright, that's right now. Alright, that was 29 seconds.
I'm just going to start off by frontlining the first couple of responses they make on our uniqueness, and then I'm going to give evidence for their case. Is everybody ready? Okay. Beginning time now. On our first contention, where we talk about tensions in the South China Sea, we tell you that we are very close to war right now. The way that they answer this is they tell you that essentially that we are at a new normal and there's not going to be any conflict. The biggest issue with this is they're using the Valencia evidence. The Valencia evidence is really not that good because it says that the conflicts have only been solved temporarily. What that means is that this new normal is not always going to continue. They give you the words like Valencia says peaceful. Valencia never says that the region is a peaceful area that can't be disturbed, right? What Valencia is actually saying is there are a lot of things that are happening in there that makes it very fragile. So even if we are at a new normal now, anything can tip it over the point where it's not going to be normal anymore. That's why the Af world is actually very close to war. Then go into my opponent's first contention, or their only contention, where they talk about the South China Sea. On this Valencia evidence and on this whole uniqueness debate, we're going to be winning it because we aren't in this new period of normalcy. Tensions are literally rising as we speak, because according to KBS, on literally the 4th of this month, they write that the tensions in the South China Sea are rising because of U.S. military exercises in the region. Remember, Jennings says, however, the modest U.S. concession is going to solve this. At that point, we have the most recent evidence in this round. We post-date everything that they're going to give you. We're controlling the uniqueness here. Then go into their actual specific links. First of all, they tell you that we're going to be cornering China with the tribunals. That's not true though, however, because Yang, which they completely drop in our case, says that we take them out of the corner because now they don't have to act in self-defense. Jennings says that when the United States is not being, or is not, nobody's like going after the power in the South China Sea, China literally has no reason to expand. They do not contest this warrant. Then, second, they talk about American exceptionalism. However, realize that like these peace talks have been ignored in the past by China. They give you no reason for why in their world it's actually going to solve. In our world, we have a lot of actors that are much more effective in bringing China to the table, especially because in this unique situation, China is no longer feeling the pressure of U.S. hard power. Then go on to their third link, where they talk about how you're going to be emboldening allies. That doesn't matter though at the point where we're going to say that diplomacy is going to reassure all the allies in the region. If on our side we reassure them, then this link doesn't matter. At that point, let's go on to their specific impacts. First, they talk about war. War is really likely in the status quo because of the current U.S. positioning in the South China Sea. You extend the Etler evidence from Case. He explains that because of China's power-grabbing, the United States aggression in the region. Then extend Jennings, who explains that if the U.S. were less aggressive, China wouldn't have a reason to expand aggressively. The reason why this evidence is going to outweigh theirs, even though they're clashing, is because A, when the U.S. ramps up aggression, China responds by deploying more military installations, meaning that our link is empirically true. And then B, Haas and Chodbury both explain that the region is extremely close to war in the status quo, and meaning that the strategy that they're talking about literally is not working for war. At that point, we're going to be linking into war much easier. You don't look at their Blumenthal evidence. But then let's go on to their their final impact, where they talk about cyber terror. Basically, there's going to be a couple of issues with cyber terror. First, John Lindsay of the University of Toronto writes that the catastrophic cyber attacks are extremely unlikely because the US has strong defenses and large-scale attacks are too difficult to coordinate. In fact, what the DoD says is that they get attacked 10 million times a day with literally no impact. Problematically, there exists no convincing strategic motive for China to go in the region and to destroy the US grid. Second of all, though, Jesse Dunowitz of the Scientific American University explains that the US grid is built on reliability and safety, and that not even if the grid goes down, manual operations would be successful in restoring infrastructure, usually within hours. My opponents can't claim their impact because these massive, indefinite blackouts are simply not going to happen. Eventually, the power is going to be restored. Then, finally, Leela Key of Global Sign Interest Group explains that the grid providers are being hacked every day but are unsuccessful due to major systems being offline or accessible only to private networks. If what my opponents are saying was true, then we would have already seen this impact triggered. Literally, they just don't have access to these grids. There's no way to hack them. At the end of the day, for these reasons, we affirm.
Is everyone ready for cross? Can I have the first question?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about your Etler evidence. It indicates that that war is likely in the status quo.
Yes.
When will it occur?
Any day now, I guess.
So when is Etler from?
2018.
Okay, when in 2018?
Doesn't matter. We're giving you evidence from like literally 4
does.
days ago that says the tensions are rising too. Like it's just
No,
saying.
So my question is, if tensions are rising and you have all these claims that there's going to be war in the status quo, why hasn't it occurred yet?
Because tensions increase, and then once you reach a point
Wait.
where it goes
Yeah.
over the edge,
What's
that's
that
when you
point?
get to war. There's like a threshold for where conflicts can
Yeah.
lead to miscalculation,
question.
and we're saying that the closer you get to that threshold, the more
my
likely
question.
war is.
What is that threshold?
There's no quantifiable threshold for like if
you
there's this
contextualize
much.
it?
Can I what?
Can you contextualize it?
No, you can't well, bright line for war is not something physical that you can look at and say
That's
this
not
will
what I'm
cause
asking.
war. But miscalculation. Here's how miscalculation works, okay? Basically, when someone does something threatening to another country, and that country might think that it's provoking a war, you would want to be the first one to attack.
I know what miscalculation is.
Okay,
My question is,
that's what we're
at
talking
what
about.
point does miscalculation lead to conflict? Because
Miscalculation-
historically speaking, miscalculation has never led
Oh,
to conflict.
literally, okay, first of all, miscalculation has led to conflict. Second of all,
Where?
I mean, J. Albert can probably talk about it. I'm really bad at history. But like, miscalculation, literally every time there's every time there's any sort of provocation, you have a risk of miscalculation. Like, yeah.
There's
Okay,
a
can I
risk
have
of there's a risk of rain right now, but it probably won't
How is
rain.
war gonna happen in your world? Like,
Yeah, that's our narrative. Our narrative is very clear from the get-go.
how does
We tell
war
you-
ever happen?
What?
How does war ever happen?
Yeah, war happens when countries are in desperate need and they need to, in this instance, China would be in desperate need because they lose control of the South China Sea, right? Our argument is that a cession threatens the South China Sea and that would cause China to
We're saying
black
if the
out.
U.S.
I have a question.
decreases, we're saying if the U.S. decreases their military, then no
The
longer
US
does
does not
China
decrease
feel.
their military because
Wait,
when
yours-
they affirm, they
the
have
main-
different
sure.
interpretations of unclose. Can I have a question?
Yeah.
There's like 2 minutes. Yeah, okay. Let's talk about your response at the top of our case. You tell us that Young says that they need self-defense, right?
Young, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. What are they needing to be defended against?
China wants to maintain the power that they have in the South China Sea, and
They
if the
want to
United
maintain,
States,
wait. They want to maintain power in the South China Sea.
yes,
Okay, great.
sure.
You can have a question.
Yeah, let's look at the. Oh yeah, and the fact that in the past South China Sea, like China has ignored tribunals. Doesn't that mean that they're not very like?
So China has ignored tribunals when the United States wasn't in UNCLOS. That is not unique to our position or our.
If the U.S. is less threatening, aren't they more likely to negotiate?
I'm sorry. What?
If the U.S. is less threatening, okay, sure, it's a yes or no, but.
We'll start our running clock on prep now.
Are you guys taking prep?
Oh yeah.
Okay, cool.
Alright, stop that. We have 3 seconds left.
Don't use it all up at once.
Who's gonna need it? Alright. It's gonna start off on our case. Time machine. Alright, we all good? Cool. Starting off from the top on the uniqueness debate, their only response to our uniqueness arguments are that phone ops are rising tensions now. However, this evidence is literally a hype. Phone ops are the norm. They've been happening for so long. Their evidence, it's literally overhypes the impact of phone ops. They've been happening for years. But extend the Hadarian and the Orchard evidence, both of them indicate that right now, Asian countries are starting to lose steam in negotiations with China, and they're beginning to cave in and starting to make concessions to China. The Hadarian evidence indicates that the Philippines are pursuing a policy of accommodation. That means that they are starting to make compromises with China over the South China Sea. That is a peaceful resolution of the South China Sea that they can't access because our Beneco evidence indicates that when we accede to UNCLOS, it restores faith in a liberal international order, and it restores faith that countries are going to be able to get the entirety of the South China Sea from China. The problem with this is that they will never be able to do that because our Blumenthal evidence indicates that there are geostrategic reasons as to why China has staked their claim in the South China Sea, and they would never give up those claims. But pressuring them on those claims risks war because our Farley evidence indicates that Xi has boxed himself into a political corner in the South China Sea, and Xi has boxed himself into a political corner in the South China Sea, and if you press him too hard, he'll risk war. Moving on to their case. They say that the status quo, if all of their uniqueness arguments were true, there would literally be war right now. But this quo isn't war, even though tensions have been high, which means that they are the only thing that would change the status quo and escalate it into conflict. The fact that there isn't conflict now means that there's only a risk that they send it into conflict. They conceded that China is pursuing a divide and conquer strategy that refuses to cooperate with multilateral institutions, preferring to use bilateral negotiations, and bilateral negotiations are net better because they concede that the more voices equals less compromise because there's so many voices at the table that they'll never be able to reach a singular perspective.
We'll take some prep time starting now. that was 58. Opponent ready?
Yeah.
Judge ready? Alright, it'll be our case and then their case. Starting the uniqueness. Josh tells you the KSP evidence from 4 days ago, which says that tensions are rising right now as we see drills in the region. They say that war would have already happened and phone-ups are a regular thing. However, we see more than just phone-ups. We see B-52 bombers in the region. We see air flights. And moreover, we see military drills which happened just recently. They say war would have happened already, and that's not true. We're literally building up to war. That's how war works. Now, they make a few responses. First, they say China only goes to war if its interests are threatened. However, what they fail to see is that the biggest interest is surpassing U.S. hegemony. This has been their biggest interest in the past 3 decades, and this is the biggest impact that affects them. They don't care about squabbling with smaller regional allies. They care about going for the big dog. And that's why this is the biggest impact in this round and the biggest threat to China. This is what's going to convince them to go to war. And then secondly, they turn saying that UNCLOS will encourage military excursion by U.S. That's not true. Articles 88 reserves the seas for peaceful purposes, which is increasingly accepted internationally, that it prohibits phone-ups. And at the very least, it creates diplomatic backlash against all these military excursions they talk about. With that in mind, go to our second warrant on proving dialogue. We tell you that we're in a diplomatic stalemate in the status quo because China is literally refusing to negotiate until we accede. They make an argument about legitimacy. We're not talking about legitimacy. And then they turn by saying that China only wants bilateral agreements, but they never explain why multilateral agreements are the only option under UNCLOS. They can still happen in our world. At the end of the day, Rieger says this is extremely important because dialogue reduces tensions by getting actors on the same page. And this is why she says it's literally a prerequisite to conflict. The UNDP says that conflict has decreased as dialogue has increased. Now, they also turn it again by saying that we push out China, which leads to war. However, we don't need to push out China in our world because we reach an agreement. The impact is trade. Remember Morrow, who says that only few businesses continue to do trade on a large scale. When these tensions rise, that means that we have less jobs leading to more poverty. That's the World Bank. Now go on to their case on Valencia. Let's go to their case. First, the only link they extend is ASEAN, saying that they're caving into China. However, the U.S. hegemony is a much bigger issue to China. China cares not that much about ASEAN, but more about overtaking the U.S. That's the biggest issue to them, and the only way that they're actually going to go to war. And then finally, they drop their impacts. But first on war, remember war is more likely in their world. But secondly, on hackers, the DoD says that we have 10 million attacks a day, and those don't have any issues. Thank you.
Can we have the first question if everybody's ready?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So let's talk about how you say that China's biggest interest is being the hegemon.
Yes.
Right? Is the South China Sea crucial to China becoming the global hegemon?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so I think that there might be confusion here because there are multiple issues in the South China Sea. One is with ASEAN, with the islands, about their territorial claims. But there's another issue with the U.S. over what rights they have over innocent passage. So there are two separate issues here. One of them represents ASEAN and one represents the U.S.
My question is the South China Sea critical for Chinese hegemony over the world? Yes or no?
Yes, one aspect.
There you go.
Yes.
We're
not talking about yours, we're talking about the innocent passage.
I'll explain if I'm focused.
Um,
You have a question.
Actually, you guys can.
yeah, wait. You say that war is like not the only, or like in our world, we only risk triggering war. Can't like war happen in the status quo?
We don't think that war can happen in the status quo because tensions are decreasing. That's our Hidarian evidence.
Wait, when is that from?
Hidarian is from earlier this year, like in the summer of this year. He tells you that countries are throwing the towel.
One sec. I know what you're thinking about your phone ops argument about how phone ops are increasing tensions, but the response.
Okay, just to clarify, that's not our argument. It's phone ops in addition to other stuff. But
yeah, it's like military drills. We've had military drills in that region for like decades.
Okay.
Right, but the point is that they're increasing in production.
Yeah.
If you look at what China's doing, they're also
drills
increasing
in the region for decades.
Right, but we've had drills, but also if you keep in mind the rhetoric and the consistency of the drills, that also affects what happens.
Yeah, like the amount of drills, like if you're doing one drill or you're doing a lot of drills like every single day,
You
there's
have
a
to establish
difference.
some sort of bright line between like when
Right, okay, so look to our Haas
Haas
evidence. We're going to have war within 10 years. I mean, obviously we can't tell you exactly when this is going to happen or what exactly will happen. I mean, also if you're wondering, Farley 18 says that there could be collisions which lead to war.
Can I take a question about dialogue?
Yeah.
Right. So if there's more voices at the table, does that increase or decrease the chance of one unified compromise?
I'm not sure why there would be more voices at the
It doesn't also matter though at the point where our impact is if you're at the table, the dialogue itself is what like solves, right? Because when you have dialogue, you don't go to war.
By that logic, there is that dialogue in the status quo.
No, there's not. Like we're
Because
telling
they're
you.
using bilateral agreements in the status quo,
Which
specifically
bilateral-
between China and Vietnam.
Yeah, that,
I think
yeah,
what we're
that
trying
doesn't-
No,
to
we're
get at,
talking
it's
about
not
the
at
U.S.
all-
and China. I
yeah,
think
what
this
we're
is where we're
trying-
getting
okay,
confused.
yeah.
You guys are talking about ASEAN. We're talking about the U.S. and China and the fact that they haven't made any actual
China and the
progress.
United States also have exchanged dialogue with each other over many issues.
Right, so they've had dialogue, but they haven't made any real progress. This is what our authors say. It's prevented talking about
Okay.
substantive issues, like
Well,
their
we're-
core
we're-
interests and what they're
okay.
willing to compromise.
What we're trying to get at is that you say that UNCLOS can still facilitate bilateral conversations in your summary. Our argument is like, why does UNCLOS uniquely help facilitate those conversations?
because it gives them a.
All right, we'll talk about it.
We have 3 seconds. We'll start that now. Yeah. No, up 6. All right. Okay. Yeah. Is everyone ready? It's going to start on the app. The first piece of offense that they extend is the fact that there are military drills and phone ops in the status quo. The problem is, as everybody knows, that these drills and phone ops have existed for decades. There is no unique reason as to why tensions are increasing. They use the word tensions a lot, but if tensions don't actually manifest in conflict, I would argue that the status quo is preferable because there is no conflict. And there has been no conflict for the decades since we've had military drills in the region. There is no reason to believe as to why there would all of a sudden be a war right now. They talk about like hegemony, and they say that China's biggest interest is passing U.S. hegemony. The only plausible way that China could ever pass U.S. in its hegemony is if they fully utilize the South China Sea. This is exactly our warrant. If the United States goes into the region through phone ops and military drills in the affirmative world, which would increase these things, then China has a unique reason to lash out. At this point, Isaac clearly extends the Farley impact, where we tell you there would be a Sino-U.S. war at a conventional level. The Farley evidence indicates that if there is a conflict between China and the United States, millions would die. China would do this because they themselves tell you that its hegemony is its biggest thing, like most important thing that they go in foreign policy. Then they talk about dialogue. This is what their main offense comes from. There's 2 terms which Isaac cleanly extends in summary. The first is that multilateralism fails because China uses a divide and conquer strategy in which they prefer bilateral treaties, for example, with the Vietnam and Philippines. At this point, cross-fly or Hadarian evidence. This is really, really important because Hadarian tells you that countries are throwing the towel and allowing China to do what they want in the region as opposed to getting crushed by them in a war. Then, the second warrant is that if there are more voices at the table, there is less likely for peaceful compromise. Go on to our case, we link into war, Isaac extend the Orchard evidence and the Vineca evidence, which tells you that if we don't restore faith, there would be a war in the status quo. At this point, the strength of link weighing is ultimately where you sign your ballot. We tell you, if both of us impact to war, the person who links in the strongest wins the debate. For 2 reasons. One, the directionality of the link. The status quo is peaceful and has been peaceful for decades. The only way you change that is if you affirm. And second, their starting point evidence is wrong. Countries are throwing the towel right now. Diplomacy is happening right now. There's peace in the region right now. Don't change that and affirm.
I will take the rest of our practice. Write this down. Oh, yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna start off on uniqueness. Is everybody ready?
Yep.
Okay. Starting time now. My opponents come up here and they paint a picture to you that right now we are in a very peaceful era and there's going to be no conflict because for decades everything that's happened in the past has continued to happen. There's no sort of break for war. The biggest issue here is they don't have a single piece of evidence in the final speech that actually says that war is more peaceful. All they have is this Valencia evidence, but this evidence never even says the word peaceful in it. At that point they have no reason to think why we are not close to war. We give you a lot of reasons why we're close to war though. First of all, remember the Haas evidence that says that we are within 10 years of war. Then second second of all, remember the KSP evidence that says literally 4 days ago that tensions are rising in the South China Sea. We are not at a new normalcy, and this is very unique to now, right? We give you 3 things that they're doing. They're increasing phonons, they're increasing B-52 air flights, and they're increasing overall air flights in the region. These 3 reasons alone are showing you that right now there's a unique danger that is in the South China Sea. They tell you that we don't have a brink for war. The brink for war is when you do more and more of these as opposed to doing less of them. That's when you get closer to war. That's when you meet the brink. Every time we have a provocation now, and as we increase the quantity of provocations in a short time period, that is a higher probability of miscalculation that we both talk about happening in our cases. At that point, let's go on to at that point, tensions, there's something different now. Then, let's go on to where they tell you that multilateral sovereignty fails and China has always, other countries are throwing in the towel. First of all, they don't tell you why bilateral agreements can't work at all, but then second of all, they tell you that more dialogue means that there's going to be an increase in the overall amount of conflict. That's not true. Either countries are talking and countries are not talking. If countries are not communicating, that means that you have a higher probability of war. At that point, you can cleanly extend our evidence from Riker that says that tensions decreased when we have more dialogue in the past. Only in our world are you actually able to have effective dialogue at the end of the day. So because war is uniquely close right now, and only in our world are you able to have negotiations, even if they're not successful, just having countries at the table means that we will not have a war at the end of the day. And for these reasons, we negate.